Hello and Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today I'd like to do a video on the topic of human suffering, and because it comes up in conversations sometimes where people who, especially who are not people who believe in God or are on the fence, they want to, they see indications, but they can't quite get there. And one of the reasons that sort of prevents them is that they feel that if there was a God, there is just no way that God could have created a world in which there's so much suffering. So the question today would really is to take a look at human suffering and to really ask the question, who really is responsible for human suffering? Essentially, where does it come from? How does it arise? And how are we to, once we understand where it comes from, certainly from the Qur'anic point of view, how do we take stock of it and move forward with that information at hand? So without further ado, I'd like to begin. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. So because we are talking about human suffering, I want to offer a definition so we understand exactly what we're talking about. So suffering is described in the dictionary as a state of undergoing pain, distress, or hardship. Okay? Undergoing pain, distress, or hardship. It is also explained as the experience of being subjected to something bad or unpleasant, to become or appear worse in quality, be affected by or subjected to an illness or an ailment. So, and lastly, in Buddhism, three types of suffering are distinguished in this religion. They say that one is pain, such as old age, sickness, and death. From pleasure, changing to pain, and from the fact that because of the impermanence of our life, beings are susceptible to pain in the next moment. So essentially, that pain comes from old age, sickness, and death, from the pleasure changing to pain, and that the fact that life is essentially built on impermanence, that every moment there is change. Okay. Now, I mentioned this last definition that comes out of Buddhism because this is the sort of pain that's built into life itself. And I'm not so much going to look at that aspect of pain or the cause of, as that being one of the cause of pain, but and when I say that being the cause of pain, I mean that simply being born into the world, right? We know that by virtue of being human, of being here, that pain is inevitable, such as the Buddhist definition states, sickness, old age, death. These things cause pain to our friends, our loved ones, ourselves. I feel like we, as human beings, already have an understanding of those things already. We know that, yes, death. We know that natural disasters, hurricanes, the destruction of our homes from those things, being hit by lightning, being drowned in a tsunami, or things of that nature. Just these things do so result in suffering and distress and pain. However, we kind of already know that. I wouldn't want want to talk about what seems to be the obvious already. So I'm going to ignore the pains that result from simply being born into the world and being subjected to the natural environment. However, I do want to look at pain and suffering that comes about from our belief system and our actions. And to give you a comprehensive Qur'anic view of how this pain and suffering begins and how it started, essentially. Before we can talk about human suffering, we have to understand something that happened according to the Quranic point of view before the existence of time itself. And there's a Quranic verse that speaks to this, and it starts with acknowledging that there was something, there was this trust being offered to all of creation, and of course man as well. And we were, when I say man, of course I mean human beings. And human beings, out of everything, had accepted this trust. And we really need to look at what this really means and what are its implications as it results, as it lends to this discussion of suffering, human suffering. So I'm going to just take some time to talk about the trust, and then we will lead into how suffering ultimately began. Now, in the Quran, we hear Allah says that, "Verily we offered the trust unto the heavens and the earth and the mountains, but they refused to bear it, and were afraid thereof, and man undertook it. Verily he is unjust ignorant." Now, this trust, God says we offered it to the creation, the heavens and the earth and the mountains and human beings as well. And of course, there seems to be some wisdom in not accepting the trust ultimately. However, God says the reason why they did not accept the trust was they were afraid. And there seems to be this wisdom behind this, and interesting when you look at the Quran, the Quranic literature, there is this notion that the fear of God is really the beginning of wisdom. And not only that, but when you look at whenever messengers or prophets come to the community, we often hear in the Quran, one of the things that they say is, "Believe in him, obey me, and fear Allah." These are the three things that they say. And there's a reason for that. And oftentimes in Islamic literature, one of the wisdoms behind fear is not often is that it's wise, it's within our best interest to fear Allah. Now, the Quran, of course, doesn't promote irrational fear of God. It's not the type of fear that I'm referring to by any chance, but rather when we understand God in His true majesty, that and greatness, that from that comes the wisdom to fear Him. Anyhow, without dwelling too much on that, the creation recognized that, hey, listen, that it's not worth whatever whatever the risks are of disobeying Allah, it's not worth it. So this trust has within it the capacity to disobey God. And God said that they had feared the implications or the punishment of that. So they said no, we don't want it. However, man accepted it, and God said, well, he was foolish and he was unjust. Now, the hadiths, the imams have interpreted through the hadiths that says that the part that talks about of this verse that says that verily man is unjust and ignorant is really a reference to the fact that those people who break this trust or this covenant between us and God, that in doing so they wrong themselves, or they are unjust to themselves, because they in breaking the trust they perform deeds that are contrary or sinful. So ultimately, what this trust is simply a covenant between human beings and God. And this covenant really has certain, it's essentially God disclosing his oneness to human beings so that they can recognize that he is our Lord and that there is no God other than him. And in recognizing this, we recognize the oneness of God, which is a term referred to in Islam as Tawheed, right? The divine oneness, right? And at this point, we witness God's divine oneness. We witness that he is our Lord, and we testify to this, okay? So this is essentially what the trust is. So there's a Qur'anic verse in chapter 7, 172, in which God says regarding the covenant. He says, when thy Lord drew forth from the children of Adam, al-Islam, from their loins their descendants, and made them testify concerning themselves, saying, am I not your Lord who cherishes and sustains you? They said, yeah, we do testify. This lest ye should say on the day of judgment, of this we were never mindful. So what's interesting about this trust or covenant that God offered to human beings was an agreement that made them recognize him as their Lord, and so that on the day of judgment that they wouldn't have, or we wouldn't have, an excuse before God on the day of judgment in which we would say, well, we were never mindful that you are our creator. We didn't know. Now, it's important to recognize that yes, human beings, when they come into the world, they are not aware of this interaction with God that they had, in which there was a covenant that was formed and bonded them to him in this way. However, God, as a result of this covenant, is responsible, or is made responsible as part of the obligation of this agreement between him and us, that he would remind us of this covenant that we made with him, in which we did acknowledge his divinity and his lordship. And the way he would do this is he would send messengers or prophets to human beings. And in the message that he sends with them would be truths that would enable us to inwardly recognize and acknowledge the truth of his message. And revelations in the form of the Torah, revelation in the form of the Injil, which was given to the prophet Christ, and revelations given to Muhammad are among some of the few revelations that were given to prophets. And there were many prophets. And of course, Muslims acknowledge and know that there's 124,000 prophets. Not everyone, of course, were given a book of revelation, but revelation or inspiration nonetheless, or guidance nonetheless for their people. And essentially the guidance is to turn us back to remembering this covenant, because there are certain expectations both on Allah's side in terms of what he's obligated to do for us, and on our side in terms of what we're obligated to, how we're obligated to respond. I should probably also note that the covenant, inherent in the covenant is this ability to have free will, and also knowledge. These are all byproducts of this this covenant, which is why when you look at all of creation, the only creature that has this capacity to have free will and to learn and to be aware and to have knowledge and to grow in knowledge are human beings. This is all part of the blessings that come from this covenant. However, this as well has made human beings morally and religiously responsible for their conduct. And in fact, not only their conduct, but also their motives, their intentions, because in the Quran, God says that every intention, every feeling, every thought, every action will be inquired into. So, like I was saying, the covenant has obligations on both sides. And we see this being very explicit in the Quran in chapter 2, verse 40, when God is speaking about the children of Israel, the Jews. And he says, "O children of Israel, call to mind the special favor which I bestowed upon you, and fulfill your covenant with me as I fulfill my covenant with you, and fear none but me." So 3 elements in this particular verse that's relevant for us is that, when the Quran was revealed, God was reminding the Jews through the Prophet Muhammad that, listen, there was this covenant between us, and it refers back to the pre-temporal covenant. And when Moses was sent to the Jews, in the tablets was written down how this covenant was to be enacted. And God says that this was a special favor that he had sent this messenger to them. Through Moses, he wanted to liberate them out of the oppression and tyranny under which they lived. The second aspect of this verse is that God is showing us that he will fulfill his aspect of the covenant, and he expects that, certainly in this verse, but by extension all communities, that they also will be expected to fulfill their aspect of the covenant. And there is a caution or a caveat within the verse as well. And God says, and fear none but me. Okay. Now, on the side of Allah, he's obligated through this covenant to do a couple of things. And to that effect, he says that he will send messengers to guide men. So he will send his revelations. And he will forgive human beings. Okay, this is part of the covenant. And in forgiving human beings, he will reward them. And this reward will ultimately see itself in the fulfillment of access or entry into paradise, which is the ultimate reward. And lastly, that he will hold human beings to account, and that of course means to that would result in punishment, or even in some cases, regrettably, the curse of God, which hellfire is the ultimate manifestation of that curse. Now, on the side of man, or the obligations of man as it relates to this covenant, human beings are expected to believe in God, to not associate anything with him or with his Godhead, and to accept and support the messengers or prophets that have been sent by him to their communities. And secondly, that they are to fight in the way of God, or do jihad in the way of God. Now, this jihad, we've talked about this in previous videos. It has both a militaristic component, but it is not necessarily limited to that. In fact, when one fights on the battlefield, as much as it is a great honor to be what is known as a martyr or a shaheed in Islam, that's considered the lesser jihad, or the lesser struggle. In fact, that there is a much greater struggle, or a greater jihad, because this is what jihad ultimately means. It means struggle, particularly in the form of spiritual struggle. And this spiritual struggle that's much greater than fighting on the battlefield is known as the greater jihad, Jihad al-Akbar. So God says that one of the other obligations is that you're expected to fight in the way of God. So on the battlefield, to defend the Muslim or your community in which you live in, and more importantly, to always do spiritual struggle against anything that may be harmful to your soul. And lastly, to establish prayers and perform charity and purify the self. Now, we know that in Islam, that if the prayers, we know that God said that he created human beings and jinns. I won't talk too much about the jinns, but we'll include them because they are included. That he created them in order that, he created us in order that we may worship him. And the clearest manifestation of this worship is the act of the specific prayers that's given to us in our respective religions, whether that be within Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, or any other books prior to that. In Islam, it's the salat. We refer to the prayer as the salat, and we have to establish that. So we have to do that. And in addition to that, whenever you look at prayer within the Quran, it's always linked with or coupled with charity. And so charity as well as an obligation. And we know, I think I may have spoken to some extent about a little bit about charity, but charity, there's an expected amount, and then there is a voluntary amount. So you can But I won't get too much into that. Now, of course, the ultimate goal of all of these things is to the result of, or to the purpose of, cleansing or purifying the self, or becoming close to God. So I want to leave it there for now. I'm going to continue in the next video. If you like what you're hearing and you'd like to hear more, please stay tuned, and I will see you shortly. Assalamu alaikum.